In Zurich. In a stone tower he built with his own hands. A man locks the door behind him. He opens a book bound in red leather. He picks up a pen. And then he begins speaking. To people who are not there. He is not hallucinating. He is not breaking down. He is Carl Jung, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe. And for the next 16 years, he will keep this book hidden from the world. Inside it are conversations with the dead, descents into what he called the underworld of the psyche, and a figure he meets again and again in the dark, a figure that looks exactly like him, and hates everything he loves. He will later give that figure a name. He will call it the shadow. This is not a story about mysticism for its own sake. It is not a fable. It is the buried origin of one of the most disturbing ideas in modern psychology. The idea that the person you believe yourself to be is only half of who you actually are, and that the other half has been locked in a room inside you since childhood, waiting. By the end of this, you will not look at your own reflection the same way, because somewhere underneath the version of you that shows up to work, that smiles at family dinners, that apologizes when it isn't your fault, there is another one, older, angrier, more honest, in its own terrible way. And it has been shaping your choices your entire life, without ever once asking your permission. So here is the question this entire film is going to orbit. And I want you to sit with it, because there is no easy answer waiting at the end. If the parts of yourself you find most shameful are also the parts that make you whole, what have you been mutilating yourself to hide? Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, the son of a pastor who Jung later said had lost his own faith, and simply performed it, year after year, like a man reciting lines he no longer believed. That contradiction, the gap between what a person shows and what a person actually is, would follow Jung for the rest of his life. He trained as a psychiatrist at the Bergholzli Hospital in Zurich, where he worked with patients suffering from schizophrenia. Patients everyone else had written off as simply broken. Jung did something almost nobody else in psychiatry was doing at the time. He listened to their delusions as if they meant something. Not as noise, as language. In 1907, he met Sigmund Freud in Vienna, and the two men talked for 13 hours straight. Freud believed he had found his successor. He called Jung his crown prince, the man who would carry psychoanalysis into the next generation. But by 1913, the alliance was over. Freud believed the unconscious was mostly a warehouse of repressed sexual conflict. Jung believed it was something far older, far stranger. A layer of the mind shared by every human being alive, populated by figures and patterns that show up in myths, dreams, and religions across cultures that never once made contact with each other. He called it the collective unconscious. There was a specific moment historians point to. In 1909, on a ship crossing the Atlantic together, Jung told Freud about a dream, a house with floors he had never noticed before, each one older than the last, until the final staircase led down into a prehistoric cave carved with bones and broken pottery. Freud wanted to know whose bones, whose death wish. Jung refused to answer, because he had already begun to suspect the dream wasn't about his own repressed desires at all. It was about something structural, a mind built in layers, with something far older than any single person's memory buried at the bottom of it. Freud never forgave the refusal. Jung never abandoned the idea. The break with Freud cost Jung almost everything: his reputation, his academic standing, many of his colleagues. And in the months after, Jung entered what he privately called his confrontation with the unconscious. A period so disorienting that some of his biographers have simply called it his breakdown. Here is what almost no one outside serious Jungian scholarship knows. For the next several years, Jung deliberately induced altered states of consciousness. He would sit alone, let his rational mind go quiet, and allow images to rise up from somewhere underneath it. He called this method active imagination. And what rose up terrified him. He met a winged old man named Philemon, who spoke to him with an authority Jung said did not feel like it came from his own mind at all. He descended, in vision after vision, into landscapes he described as an underworld, caves, deserts, seas of blood. And again, one figure returned. A double. A twin. Everything about Jung that Jung refused to be. He recorded all of it, in careful, elaborate detail, in the book that would come to be called the Red Book, Liber Novus. He illustrated it himself, in a style closer to a medieval illuminated manuscript than a scientific journal. And then he sealed it. He showed it to almost no one. It would not be published until 2009. Nearly 50 years after his death. When his family finally allowed the world to see what he had spent 16 years hiding in that tower. But here is where the story stops being about Jung's biography. And starts being about you. Because from that descent, Jung built a theory that quietly reshaped psychology, art, and the way an entire century understood the self. And the theory begins with a claim most people find, at first, almost insulting. Every human mind, Jung argued, builds a persona, a mask assembled out of what our family rewarded, what our culture approved of, what kept us safe as children. And every single trait that mask could not hold. Every impulse judged too selfish, too angry, too strange, too much, does not disappear. It gets pushed into a second structure Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. That is the part almost everyone gets wrong. The shadow is simply everything about you that was never allowed to be seen. Jung chose the word persona deliberately. It is the Latin term for the masks worn by actors on the stage in Greek and Roman theater. Hollow, painted faces held up in front of the real one, designed to be recognized from a distance and read correctly by an audience. He wanted the implication to be uncomfortable. Every polished version of yourself that other people applaud is, by definition, a performance. And a performance, by definition, requires something to hide behind it. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Jung believed the shadow does not stay quietly locked away. It leaks. It appears in the people you cannot stand, because we tend to despise most fiercely, in others, the exact traits we have exiled in ourselves. It appears in your dreams, wearing the face of a stranger who is somehow more familiar than anyone you know. It appears in the sudden, disproportionate anger you cannot explain, in the attraction you're ashamed of, in the cruelty you swore you were incapable of. Until the one moment you weren't. Jung called this projection, and he considered it one of the most dangerous mechanisms in the human mind, because a person who has never met their own shadow will spend their entire life fighting it in everyone around them instead. Modern research on cognitive dissonance and denial has, decades later, mapped much of the same terrain in more clinical language. The mind will go to extraordinary lengths to protect its preferred self-image, even when the evidence against it is overwhelming. Jung simply arrived there first, and he arrived through a locked door in a stone tower instead of a laboratory. Look closely at the people history remembers as certain of their own righteousness. and you often find the clearest case studies. The reformer consumed by a hatred that mirrors exactly what he claims to fight. The accuser whose fury seems disproportionate to the crime. Jung was not being poetic when he warned that nations, not just individuals, could be possessed by an unowned shadow. He watched it happen in Europe in his own lifetime, and it terrified him more than any vision in the tower ever did. And this is where the descent turns personal. Because Jung did not believe this was a flaw to be corrected. He believed it was a wound built into the architecture of becoming civilized at all. A child does not choose which parts of itself get rewarded and which get punished into hiding. Society chooses. Parents choose. Culture chooses. And by adulthood, most people are walking around powered by only half of their own psychic material, with the other half operating in the dark, uninvited, ungoverned. So here is the contradiction that should feel impossible to resolve. If the shadow contains the very thing civilization needed you to bury in order to make you safe to live with, then integrating it, becoming whole, requires you to reclaim exactly the parts of yourself that made you acceptable to other people in the first place. Jung's answer to this was not repression, and it was not indulgence. It was something far more demanding. He called it integration. And later, individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the entire self, shadow included, rather than the polite fraction of it that was allowed to walk in daylight. Here is the central claim, and I want you to hold it clearly, because everything in Jung's later work builds from this single sentence. You cannot become whole by defeating your shadow. You can only become whole by making room for it. Not by acting on every dark impulse. Not by excusing cruelty as authenticity. Jung was explicit about this. Indulgence is not integration, it is simply a different form of being ruled by the thing you refuse to understand. Integration means something narrower and far harder. It means looking directly at the trait you have spent your life denying, and admitting, without flinching, that it belongs to you. Jung himself provided the evidence that this was not merely theory. After the Red Book years, colleagues who had known him before the confrontation with the unconscious described him as changed, not softened, but somehow more solid, as though a divided house had finally found a single occupant. He went on to develop the ideas that would define analytical psychology for the rest of the century: the anima and animus, the archetypes, the process of individuation itself. None of it, he insisted, could have been reached any other way. The theory was not built from the safety of daylight. It was carried up out of the tower, out of the underworld, out of the years he spent speaking to a version of himself he had once refused to acknowledge existed. Marie-Louise von Franz, the analyst who worked closest to Jung in his final decades and who helped bring the Red Book's ideas into a form the wider world could actually use, described the shadow work not as therapy in the ordinary sense, but as something closer to a moral confrontation, a person sitting across from the exact qualities they had spent a lifetime condemning in others, and choosing, finally, not to look away. That confrontation, she insisted, could not be delegated. No one else could open that door for you. And this is the part that should give you a chill, if you are honest with yourself for even a moment. The trait in another person that makes your skin crawl with recognition. The joke you laugh at too hard, and then feel ashamed of. The version of yourself that appears, uninvited, in your worst dreams, wearing your face but doing the thing you would never do. Jung would tell you that is not a stranger. That is not an intrusion. That is the part of you still waiting, patiently, in the dark, for you to finally open the door. We began in a locked tower, with a man who refused to look away from what rose out of his own mind. The figure he met there did not vanish when he named it. It simply stopped being his enemy. Somewhere inside you, right now, there is a room like that. A version of yourself you have spent years keeping the door shut on. Jung's entire body of work rests on a single, uncomfortable promise: that room is not where your worst self is kept. It is where your whole self has been waiting.